Join me in today's video as I will be testing out a brand new 48 watercolour pan set from SargentArt. I will also be creating colour swatches of each colour and then loosening up with another paint first, draw later sketch to test out the paint. Hello all you wonderful and amazing people, my name is Lynette. Welcome and thank you for joining me today. So I've had a fairly limited colour palette when it comes to watercolour paints for quite some time. I've only had about 6 tubes of Daniel Smith's paints and then a Van Gogh Bright Travel palette, so I decided it was time to broaden my colour choice and invest in a wider selection of colours, and this palette definitely has a wide selection. My wonderful husband bought me these from Amazon as an early birthday present, and they finally arrived from the States and I can't wait to test them out. But first things first, Bob needs squishies. For swatching my paints, I'll be using a Sakura Koi water brush, and I'll be doing the swatches in my Pink Pig cold pressed watercolour sketch pad, which is 270 GSMs thick. I used a water resistant fine liner pen to draw out 48 separate little boxes, one for each colour, which admittedly took me ages trying to divide the page up equally. Maths has and never will be my strong point, or something that I enjoy. So before I begin making swatches with the paints, I label each box with the name of the paint and its number code so that the swatches on your paper correspond to the placement of where the paints are in the tin. One point I would like to make is when you do take the wrappers off of each pan, maybe do them one by one, unlike what I did, and then accidentally put the black where the indigo should be, and so I nearly messed up my whole swatch. I got very confused on the last column when I was doing the swatch for the black and it looked a bit blue. It took me a little while to realise where I had gone wrong, but you'll see what I mean later on in the video. But for now, with each box labelled, I can now take off the wrappers, which a bit annoyingly, the cellophane did stick to your fingers a bit. I'm not going to be making any detailed or elaborate swatches today, just a basic dark to light gradient for each of the colours. To swatch the colours, I'm using a Sakura Koi water brush, and I make sure I have a clean piece of kitchen paper to block my brush onto. And the first colour that I'll be swatching is Lemon Yellow? Lemon Yellow. I think I'm going to have to start saving up some of these outtakes. Swatching new paints, and I don't just mean watercolours, this can apply to acrylics or gouache or even pens. It can seem a bit of a tedious exercise, but it really is a useful thing to do. You can learn how the paints behave and what can you expect from them. I recommend swatching on paper that you use the most because paper does react very differently with watercolours. So in this video I'm doing it in my watercolour sketchbook, but I'll also make a swatch up on some Canson cold pressed watercolour paper. But also I think because I use watercolours a lot with regards to my bullet journal, I'll probably do some swatches in the back of my notebook too. So I'm going to continue going through the whole of the palette, laying down a graded wash, and then leave it to dry. This kind of practice gives you a really good idea of how the colours themselves behave, if it is granulating, and what you can expect from each colour when you work with them. And also so I can see just how beautiful each paint is. It's going to be so nice to have such a variety of different colours to use from now on. There are so many different shades of greens and browns in this palette that I know that I'm going to use a lot of. There's also a really good selection of pinks and yellows that I don't tend to use much in my paintings so far. But because they're there in the set, I am hoping that it will inspire me to be a bit more experimental and creative with my use of colour. Up until recently, I've been very much creating art sort of with like a bit of a goth witchy twist to it, very much inspired by the likes of Tim Burton. So I haven't really found that I've needed much variety with regards to how many different paints that I have. But now that I want to go around the Isle of Wight sketching different locations, that's changed. And so far I'm really happy with the amount of colour choice that you have in this palette and the vibrancy and richness of each of the paints. Although the last paint that I used, the bronze, was slightly disappointing. In comparison to how vibrant and wonderful the other paint seemed, this one was very muted and a bit just a little bit meh, really. The best metallic paints that I've come across so far are from Kuretake, but I'm not too fussed because there is such a wide selection within this pan set, and I didn't really buy it for the metallic paints. And there I just showed you where I messed up the labelling of the paints. But I used a white paint pen and went over the wrong label and then waited for it to dry and relabeled it properly. With all the swatches done, I can now put these paints to the test. And after the popularity of my last video where I did a paint first and then sketch after, I thought I'd do it again, but this time I'm just having a bit of a play with the paints, and I picked a colourful image from Pinterest just as a short exercise. In case you are wondering, there are going to be plenty more sketching videos from different locations around the Isle of Wight coming up on the channel. And before I start going on about this sketch, I wanted to thank you all so much for subscribing and commenting on that video. Seriously, the response has been overwhelming, really. So as a heads up, in my next video after this one, I will be doing a 1,000 subscriber giveaway to show my appreciation to you guys and for thanking you for supporting my channel. But I won't go on about it too much. I will explain all about that in the next video. So going back to this sketch, the technique I'm using today is I'm painting first and then drawing after. So the idea is to make your sketch about shapes first rather than the lines or the contours. So with regards to inks and watercolour sketching, it means painting shapes of tone and colour first and then adding ink lines on top of your painting. To me, this initially felt like a really scary prospect of just laying paint down and not having a definitive image to work from and paint in. But actually it's really fun and quite liberating. And it does kind of make you change your perspective of how you look at things. So I'm thinking about colours and shapes at the moment rather than how I'm going to colour this image in to make it look realistic. Because realism isn't what we're kind of going for with this technique. Well, not hyper-realism anyway. It's a great technique for just loosening up your painting techniques, having fun with it, and then just having a bit of a practice really with your watercolours. But I think most importantly, just having some fun with it. Initially, this is the first wash and the backbone of the painting really. Once I've placed all the basic colours and shapes where I need them to go, I can start then adding all the finer details and start building up the image so that it looks a little bit more like in the photo. I actually find this bit so fun. Some of the colours may be a little bit off with regards to their placement. So when you start adding all your lines and contours to build up the image, the colours aren't necessarily going to be in the perfect place, but that leads to a really sort of charming and quirky and loose image. I'm using a 02 water resistant black fine liner pen from Unipin. I do recommend using ink that is water resistant because if you're doing this technique, once you've put all your lines and contours down, you are probably going to want to go back over the paint again so that you can add shading and texture to your image. And that's where you can start building up some of the colour and the texture and really make your image pop. As I'm sketching out all of the plants and the foliage, I'm making lots of sort of squiggles and not overthinking it, but merely making suggestions of plant leaves. You want to simplify the details and make suggestions of things instead. There's no point drawing every single detail within the scene. With this style of painting or sketching, you can completely get away without having to draw everything accurately. The human eye will be able to tell you what it is, and it has a habit of filling in any gaps. And in my opinion, it actually adds to the overall feel of your sketch, giving it a lot more character and personality. You will notice that in places I have left some negative space, particularly on the steps and to the left-hand side of the door. Leaving areas of white and adding black really amps up the contrast and drama to your image. But I've also left some white space, particularly on the right-hand side of the steps, because obviously I've got to add all the pots and the flowers that are on the steps. And I didn't want the colours to get all muddy and murky, so leaving that negative space is quite helpful. The negative space that I left on the stairs, I purposely kind of left so that it would be the tops of the stairs, but it didn't kind of work out that way. But that's okay because I can use a white Posca paint pen to lighten up the tops of the steps. And I can also add some shadows and drop some colour into the underneath of the steps to make those brickwork look a little bit more interesting. So to add some drama and shadows to the foliage, I've added a bit of brown to the green that I was using before. And it's quite useful if you sort of squint at the picture that you're looking at. Simply it kind of helps you to see where you need to add the shadows. So in this case it's usually at the bottom of the plant, and there's quite a lot of shadows cast on the door from the foliage around the door. But I'm not overthinking what I'm doing. In fact, I'm adding some splashes to add some movement to the picture. And then for the shadows around the door, I'm using the sort of minty green that I'd already mixed up, but I've added a little bit of Payne's grey. And I love splashes, so I'm adding some to the door to add texture to the wood too. The windows definitely needed an extra layer of Payne's grey to make it a lot darker. They were looking quite muted and flat, so I'm going to add some Payne's grey onto the sort of supporting beam at the top of the door. What's it called? Lintel? Yeah, it's a lintel. And to the doorstep too. The brickwork on the steps definitely needed some more colour and texture added, so I used some raw sienna and also painted in the terracotta pots for the plants. For the pavement, I just added a very light wash of Payne's grey just to add the suggestion that there's a pavement there. I'm not going to really do much more to that. And now I'm going to add all the little pots to the bottoms of the steps. I made a mix of permanent light blue and purple to make the lobelia in the pots. And I'm just sort of stippling and making little dabs with my paintbrush to make the suggestion of the flowers. And then I let them dry before I add any more flowers. For the shading on the pots, I mix a bit of raw sienna with some burnt umber. I use the same mix to make some of the little red flowers that are in the top of the stairs. And then I sort of drop some, I think it's just permanent red, into that orange whilst it's still damp. And then it all kind of blends lovely together. I added a few extra flowers to the basket on the wall because it just seemed a bit empty. And I kind of think it added to the flow of the sketch because there's also these sort of red leaves that are tucked into the foliage growing around the door. You don't have to be literal with your sketch if you think that there's something that you can add to the picture that will make it more interesting, or indeed if you think that there's something that kind of sticks out and doesn't need to be there, then you can take that away. I wanted to add some white flowers to my pots and also add highlights to my sketch, so I'm using a white Jelly Roll gel pen to do this. And then also in a minute I wanted to add the brickwork, or add the suggestion of the brickwork in some places. So I pull out a white Posca paint pen and start adding some mortar lines between the bricks. I'm not going to bother like drawing every single brick, but just making the suggestion that that is a brick wall. I also use the Jelly Roll to add the lettering to the sign, and then I think we're pretty much there, but I do go over some of the lines in a slightly thicker fine liner, especially where there should be shadows, and I think the fine liner that I used was a size 05. And then that's pretty much it. All I need to do now is add my signature. And this was a really fun loose sketch which really helped me overcome a really bad creative week actually. For some reason this week I've been finding it really hard to get out of my head. So this was a great way to loosen up and get those creative juices flowing. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comment section below, as I love to hear from you all. And then don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.